Ladies and gentlemen, from the studios in the wrestling capital of the South, it's another terrific episode of The Binge Buster Show. Please welcome your host, Tony Binge.
All right, everyone, welcome to The Binge Buster Show as we have this special presentation tonight at this special time, 6:05, and without further ado, I'm going to bring on my co-host. I'm talking about Chris Plano. Chris, what is going on?
Oh, terrific, Tony. How are you? Thank you for making me a part of this special edition of the subject that we're talking about this week and the news that kind of, reverberated throughout the wrestling world. And starting this podcast at 6:05 tonight makes it even that much more special on a Saturday back in the day when we were watching wrestling on cable television.
Yeah, and man, it's kind of crazy. It's like today, I decided to do this podcast at 6:05 as we honor the memory of Jim Crockett Jr., probably one of the greatest wrestling promoters I know, at least of my time and your time, back during the territory days. I mean, he was the only territory that could compete with the guys up in New York. So I'm excited about that. Jim Crockett was synonymous here in the Carolinas to basically bring forth what they called real wrestling with all the big stars, future stars. I mean, if you go back and look, all the guys that become huge up in New York, they kind of broke in here in Crockett territory. You look back, Jimmy Snuka and Roddy Piper, among others. But of course, we all know the greatest wrestler in the history of pro wrestling came out of the Mid-Atlantic territory, and we're talking about Nature Boy Ric Flair. So fans, before we go any further, we're going to go right into this, get this podcast going on today as we talk Jim Crockett promotions, but more importantly, the memory of Jim Crockett Jr. Jim Crockett was an American professional wrestling promoter from 1973 to 1989. He was part owner of Jim Crockett Promotions, a wrestling company affiliated with the National Wrestling Alliance from 1976 to 1987. Jim Crockett Promotions also owned the Charlotte Orioles, a minor league baseball team based in Charlotte, North Carolina, the Winston-Salem Polar Twins in the Southern Hockey League from 74 to 75, but most importantly, Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling. And today we are going to be talking Jim Crockett Jr. of Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling. All right, fans, we are back here on the Binge Buster Show. Chris, as you alluded to at the beginning of the program, big news this week, sad news. On March the 4th, 2021, Jim Crockett Jr. Passed away due to the decline in health conditions. I think I understand that his body pretty much shut down. He stopped taking dialysis and everything like that. But instead of talking about the sad part of this news, let's talk about Jim Crockett and basically what he done to the wrestling the wrestling business. Chris, I'll start with you. What are some of your thoughts of or memories of Jim Crockett Jr.?
I mean, growing up as a kid, my first exposure has to go into two areas. One, 6:05 on WTBS every Saturday night was my first real exposure to the National Wrestling Alliance and to what was Jim Crockett Promotions. And then also reading about it in the monthly magazines back in, the late 70s, especially into the 80s and into the mid 80s more than anything else. And if there's one thing about Jim Crockett Promotions, and I think of guys like Nature Boy Ric Flair, the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, Ricky Morton with the Rock and Roll Express. When they were doing their interviews every week, they would always say the National Wrestling Alliance, and then they would always say Jim Crockett Promotions. And I just think that was the respect that they had. Not only was the man signing their paychecks every week, but the respect and the notoriety they were giving him on television, whether it was regionally or nationally. You got to tip your hat to the man and what he did for the business.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the things, that I read online this week was Jim Crockett was responsible for giving us the world's most famous, flamboyant, greatest wrestler of all time. I'm talking about Nature Boy Ric Flair, as Jim Crockett had signed Ric Flair to come work for Crockett Promotions in 1974. And I saw on Ric Flair's Facebook page, he said in 1973, I believe it was, he came to work for Jim Crockett with a little over $100 in his pocket. And that's how he got started. And so basically Jim Crockett made Ric Flair a millionaire, and I'm sure Ric Flair done the same thing. But what I like to talk about is one thing that a lot of people may not know, because a lot of times, you'd hear them talk about Jim Crockett Promotions, and they would refer to Jim Crockett Jr. as a promoter. But in reality, Jim Crockett was also the president of the National Wrestling Alliance, and he took Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling with the help of some great stars and great bookers like Dusty Rhodes, and took Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling and made it the number 2 wrestling promotion in the world, which is saying a lot in the 80s, because back then it wasn't like it is now, where you only had 2 major companies, but back then you had several territories that were promoted under either the National Wrestling Alliance banner, or either it was WWF, which is now WWE. But incidentally, Jim Crockett Sr., who owned Crockett Promotions, his overall idea, because Jim Crockett Jr. had no interest in pro wrestling, he was going to let his son-in-law John Ringley would actually, when Jim Crockett decided to retire, he was going to turn the company over to John Ringley and let him run Jim Crockett Promotions. But incidentally, I guess John Ringley was an early version of Ric Flair, and he got caught, having an affair. So at that point, he was booted out. Jim Crockett brought in wrestler George Scott as the head booker, and then at that point, he decided to put Jim Crockett Jr. in charge. And he would run Crockett Promotions, and he would bring in guys like Wahoo McDaniel and Ric Flair and Sergeant Slaughter, and a lot of guys that went on to become major stars for Vince McMahon. But they got their start here in Mid-Atlantic Wrestling. Now, Jim Crockett was the NWA president. He served as president 3 different terms. First being elected in 1980. And then again in and actually he would serve from 1980 to 1983, and then he would be elected again in 1985, and then his last term was in 1987. But by 87, we all know Crockett Promotions started to go downhill, because they started buying up dead territories and kind of put the company in bankruptcy. But what I like to touch about is how Jim Crockett blew up pro wrestling in 1985. By 1985, what had happened, Vince McMahon owned a TV time slot on Superstation TBS. For years, that was a time slot for Georgia Championship Wrestling, but the owners at that time, which I believe were the Briscoe brothers, they end up selling their part of it, and I believe Sandy Scott as well. But they sold their shares to Vince McMahon, and he decided to start bringing over the WWF guys. Of course, Georgia wrestling fans hated WWF. and they wanted Georgia Championship Wrestling back. And incidentally, Jim Crockett was able to strike a deal up with Vince McMahon and purchase that time slot. And that is when 605 World Championship Wrestling was born. And as they say, Chris, it was all uphill from there, because from 1985 to 1987, Crockett Promotions was the Mecca of pro wrestling.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. It gave them the national exposure that they needed. They were already getting the regional exposure in the Mid-Atlantic, Southeast area, but then it really made them national at that point. And the opportunity to break into other markets, like into the Northeast, into Pennsylvania, into Ohio, and out west. They even made a couple of trips out west a little bit, and it was due to WTBS in that particular program and other coverage that they were getting, magazines and in other areas. But I think it was TBS that really catapulted them and then gave them those opportunities, to do such unique tours as the Great American Bash and to put on events like Starrcade and the list goes on, where it was appealing to wrestling fans. And really, I even think it helped them even, to break into the pay-per-view market as well, too.
I agree. And one of the other highlights of Jim Crockett Jr.'s term in 1985, not only buying the TBS time slot from Vince McMahon and taking basically Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling worldwide, but he also organized the first annual Jim Crockett Sr. Memorial Cup Tag Team Tournament, in which wrestlers from 8 different National Wrestling Alliance regional territories participated in this 2-day tournament. One all day long tournament in the Louisiana Superdome in New Orleans. And of course, the main event on that one not only seen Ric Flair defend his world title, but the first ever team, and no other team could have won this tournament better. No other team deserved it more, I should say, than the Road Warriors. And so the main event ended up being 2 babyface teams, the Road Warriors, which here's the thing that I say babyface. The Road Warriors, they were like in 1985, they were they didn't they fought anybody, and so they were I guess you'd call tweeners, because they were baby faces at some, depending upon who they wrestled, or they'd be heels. But no matter what they did, the crowd still cheered them. I mean, nobody was over like the Road Warriors. And of course, in the main event for the Crockett Cup, the Road Warriors taking on Ron Garvin and Magnum TA. And after 7.5 hours, this tournament went on. The Road Warriors end up winning that, and of course, all that did was just boost the NWA and Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling. And then of course, a lot more major events came from Crockett Promotions, kind of like, as Starrcade and the Great American Bash, and of course, during this time he brought in Dusty Rhodes as the booker, and the storylines there were phenomenal. And I don't think that it will ever be replicated. I don't think wrestling will ever be as great or hot as it was from 1985 to 1987.
No, absolutely not. I mean, it was, Jim Crockett and Junior, Senior, Davy Crockett, all of them. I mean, they were going heads up with the WWF. I mean, there was no doubt about it. I mean, they never really, mentioned it, but that's what they were competing with at that time. And Vince McMahon clearly knew who they were as well, but they had a niche market.
Yeah.
And even when I talked to Jimmy Valiant in the past, Jimmy Valiant always told me this about Crockett was McMahon always went to the big cities in the WWF. He did go to some smaller markets, but he was the big city promotion, where Crockett brought the show to your hometown. Yes, did he do the big cities? Absolutely. But he did a lot of off cities as well. When you look at Asheville, North Carolina,
yep.
You look at like Greenwood, South Carolina,
Shelby.
Roanoke, Virginia, Shelby.
Yeah.
it was just, he went into different markets, Charleston, Augusta, Georgia. I mean, and he really brought it to your hometown in addition to hitting, Flair would always say, Atlanta, Charlotte, DC, Norfolk. I mean, Flair would always say the big cities, but, when Crockett was doing 2-3 shows a day or sometimes, double booking, they would be hitting those odd cities, which was great, and they were cleaning up money-wise too.
Yeah, and the cool thing that Crockett was doing during this time that Chris that you're talking about, they had two crews that would basically they would do 2 shows a night. They would have an A team and a B team, and say the A team might be down in Charlotte tonight, and the B team might be in Shelby doing the TV taping, and then over here in Greensboro they got a house show going on. But on that TV taping, because it's close by in Shelby, Shelby to Greensboro is only like an hour and a half. So they'd bring in Flair and Dusty, and they'd come in there and do their promos for the TV taping. Then they'd come down to Greensboro and work a main event match against each other. And it was just a time that like I say will never be replicated. And like I had alluded to, if you fans follow our Facebook page, I said, without Jim Crockett Jr. and Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, there would never have been the Binge Buster show, because that's, most of our content comes from NWA and Mid-Atlantic. But also there wouldn't be no Terrific Tony, because, I never, the only wrestling I ever watched as a kid, I did watch a little WWF and a little World Class, but my go-to when I wanted my wrestling fix was always Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling or World Championship Wrestling from WTBS. And, and if you fans can go back and listen to some of the previous Binge Buster shows, I've had quite a few Mid-Atlantic stars. Just a few weeks ago we had Black Bart on there, and even Bart was talking about how, once Crockett got this time slot on TBS, everybody was big stars, like overnight, so to speak. And, it's just an amazing time. And unfortunately, the wrestling community, the wrestling world, has definitely lost, a very important person. I know, I got a text message from my good friend George South, just yesterday, and in his message to me, he said, "Tony," he said, "all of our heroes are dying, man." And I said, "Yeah, George, they sure are." And George told me, how much Jimmy Crockett Jr. meant to him, and everybody, everybody out there I've ever spoke to, they've always talked, said, "Hey, Crockett, he buying the UWF and moving to Dallas was probably the worst business decision that he made, but everybody has, every person that's successful, something, you have bad judgment every now and then, but unfortunately that one thing that he done, caused the actual sale of Mid-Atlantic Wrestling, and then kind of what you say, the end of an era. But that wasn't the end of Jim Crockett. A lot of people don't know this, but when Jim Crockett Promotions sold the company to Ted Turner, Jim Crockett was still on the committee, and he was still basically helping them run the company behind the scenes, but it wasn't really advertised. By 1988, Crockett was near bankruptcy, so through the promoter Jim Barnett, he ended up selling the company to Ted Turner, and then he renamed it to World Championship Wrestling. But Crockett remained the NWA president until 1991. So he was the president. Think about this. This will give you an idea of how good of a businessman that Jim Crockett Jr. was. He was the president of the National Wrestling Alliance from 1980 to 1991. Chris, that is 11 years running the National Wrestling Alliance, which speaks high volumes from Jim Crockett Jr. Now, one other thing that I read this the other day, that even after 1991, Jim Crockett decided he wanted to get back into wrestling, and he and I believe Paul Heyman went in together and started to run a company called World Wrestling Network. They were going to be based out of the Sportatorium, the world famous Sportatorium, fans, in Dallas, Texas. And he was going to come in and help them run it. And he also brought the NWA back during this time. But what had happened at that point was Paul Heyman decided to go run ECW full time. And so Jim Crockett at that point bowed out of the wrestling business. But even after that, Jim Crockett, after his retirement from pro wrestling, he worked as a Texas realtor and mortgage loan originator. So businessman, and then you think about it like this, he was promoting wrestling business. Now he's promoting house sales, and he did very well with that as well. And then of course, on February 28th, we got word that Mr. Crockett was in grave condition, and then of course on March the 4th we got the word, and I believe it was Robert Gibson from the Rock and Roll Express was the first person to report that Jim Crockett had passed away due to liver and kidney failure, and Mr. Crockett was 76 years old. As one of the hosts of the Binge Buster show and wrestling promoter myself, and or former promoter myself and current wrestler, I want to thank Jim Crockett Jr. for all of his dedication and hard work, and putting out a great product, which made me get addicted to pro wrestling and want to be a wrestler. Even though I never got to meet Mr. Crockett, from all the people I've talked to, I'm sure he was definitely a great guy.
Yeah, absolutely. He was, a pioneer in the industry, president for the NWA on several different occasions, and that 11-year run, I think anyone might attest, might have been one of the most exciting times in the history of professional wrestling, the mid to late 80s, into 90. He made so many stars, so many names that became stars, whether it was in the NWA or other promotions, or, I think if you talk to any wrestlers from the era when Jim Crockett was in business, I think in some way, shape, or form, directly or indirectly, they had to be touched by the man at some point at the national level. Yeah,
I agree with you, Chris, 100%. I mean, Crockett was responsible for so many things in the pro wrestling industry, and of course, we alluded on this at the beginning of the show. Probably his biggest accomplishment was signing Ric Flair, and even after Ric Flair's plane crash in '75, Flair still came back, and with the help of Jim Crockett, he made over up in New York. Vince McMahon had his Hulk Hogan, who was his cartoon Superman, and he led the company into stardom. You can't help but believe that Ric Flair done the same thing, even though he wasn't the superhero cartoon, but he was the guy that every sports figure wanted to be like. Without a doubt, Ric Flair and Hulk Hogan are the two most popular wrestlers, which, in my opinion, this is my opinion, but definitely the two most famous wrestlers ever in the world. I feel that, without Ric Flair and without Hulk Hogan, all these other guys that came after, I don't think they would have even had a chance had it not been for Ric Flair and Hulk Hogan laying the groundwork down. But in order for them to lay the groundwork down, they had to have a good promoter, and Mr. Crockett and Vince McMahon were definitely that. But like I said, unfortunately, we lost Mr. Crockett, and our heart goes out to his family and everybody else that was touched. Their lives were touched by Mr. Crockett. Chris, before we go off the air tonight, you have any parting words for our Binge Buster listeners?
I mean, Tony, this has been, I really appreciate you, let me be a part of the podcast this week. It was a very special one, right at 6:05, the WTBS Superstation Hour with the National Wrestling Alliance and with Jim Crockett Promotions. And, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, a pioneer in the wrestling industry, was lost this week, but his immense contributions to the industry will never be forgotten, and I think you'll always see a footprint of it, not only now, but even in the future. And then, of course, obviously always looking towards the past. And, there's one thing about Ric Flair, he did eventually jump to the WWF in his career, but he was loyal to both Jim Crockett Sr. and Jr. And you don't see much of that now in the professional wrestling business today. But, a great man, and a great man that did great things. And really, really, I think he might have even said it at one time that it's not wrestling. I think we call it wrestling down here
That's true.
in the South. When he was referring the NWA and his promotion to the WWF, I think he used the word wrestling, RASSLIN. A great man, and I'm sure bringing back a lot of good memories for wrestlers and fans alike this week and moving forward.
Yeah, for sure. Well, fans, thank you for joining us this week on the Binge Buster Show. Next week, Chris and I are back with talking Super Clash 2. That will air next week on the Binge Buster Show. But again, fans, thank you for joining us. And make sure you go out and subscribe to our Facebook page. And if there's any topics that you would like us to talk about, send us a message and we'll do our best to make it happen. Well, Chris, I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend. I'm going to do the same. And next week, fans, Chris and I will be back with a full-length Binge Buster show. But for Chris, I'm terrific Tony Binge, coming to you from the studios here in the wrestling capital of the South. Thank you for joining us for the Binge Buster Show. We'll see you next week. And until then, so long for now.
Thank you for listening to the Binge Buster Show. Make sure you like us on Facebook and download us on your favorite podcast platform.